The hearing will serve as a foundational discussion for this panel as it moves forward in its working to examine the challenges doing business with the Department of Defense. The House Armed Services Committee has led the way in improving how DoD develops and buys equipment it needs. As most of you know, the HASC has successfully shepherded a substantial reform effort, the Weapons System Acquisition Act, through the legislative process to the President's desk. While the bill did much to garner efficiency, increase transparency, and foster competition, there is still room for improving DoD's business practices. I'm a strong believer in the fact that you can't solve the problem without looking at both sides of the equation, and that's exactly why Chairman McKean and Ranking Member Smith established this panel to look at the business side of the DoD acquisition system. I wanted to start this series of hearings with a broad look at the defense industrial base to give the panel a clear framework for moving forward. Today we have well-recognized leaders in public policy regarding the defense industrial base joining us. On November the 1st, we will follow up with senior officials from DoD's Manufacturing and Industrial Base Policy Office and Small Business Office to give us their views on the issue. After that, we'll move on to several hearings focused on some of the specific issues and challenges facing businesses that are eager to provide technologies and services to support our warfighters. We have some terrific witnesses with us today, and I'm very grateful that they've taken the time to share their insights and expertise on the defense industrial base with my colleagues. I'd like to introduce them first. Mr. Barry Watts, a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessment. Mr. Fred Downey, Vice President, National Security Aerospace Industries Association, and Pierre Chow, Senior Associate International Security Program Center for Strategic and Industrial Studies. Again, gentlemen, thanks for taking the time to be here with us today. I also want to take a minute to thank Mr. Schilling and Mr. Loebsack and their hardworking staffs for hosting the panel in the Quad Cities area of Illinois and Iowa. We had a very informative discussion there with industry leaders and learned a great deal about what goes on at the Rock Island Arsenal. It was an extremely useful trip, and I appreciate all the effort that went into it. I also want to thank Blackhawk College for letting us use their facilities to hold the meeting. The committee staff prepared a summary of discussion with the industry at Rock Island, and it was provided to all the panel members. And without objection, I'd like that to be entered into the record. Hearing no objections, so ordered. On Friday, members of the panel will travel into Akron, Ohio to hear from the industrial base in that area and to meet with engineers and scientists at the University of Akron who are engaged in efforts to help DoD prevent and mitigate corrosion. In these tough economic times, we've got to make sure we're doing everything we can to get the most out of every piece of equipment we ask the American taxpayer to provide. And mitigating and preventing corrosion is a critical part of doing so. I'm very much looking forward to that trip and the discussions on developing and then transition critical technologies to help DoD sustain its equipment. I want to thank Ms. Sutton for inviting us to her district. And with that, I turn to my friend from Washington, Mr. Larson, for any remarks he might want to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to make a brief opening statement, but also, again, to thank you for your leadership on this panel. The panel is tasked with looking at ways the Department can improve its contracting practices for the benefit of our warfighters, taxpayers, and businesses. DoD must continue its efforts of building a strategic, dynamic contracting process, one that ensures those who have great products do not fall by the wayside. Key component of this process is ensuring that we protect and grow our nation's defense industrial base. The U.S. defense base has a long history of producing the best military systems in the world. We must ensure that this continues both for our warfighter and because it creates jobs here in the U.S. In August, the Chairman and I heard from several businesses in my own district about successes and challenges that they've had with the DoD and contracting. All of these, in fact, were small businesses. These anecdotal accounts help give us an understanding of the real-world experiences small businesses face and the challenges they face while trying to do contracting with a very large government bureaucracy. Today we have witnesses that have studied Department of Defense policy and laid out policy implications and reforms that we should seriously consider as we move forward in looking at how we can help small and medium-sized businesses access the Department of Defense contracting process. I look forward to hearing today's testimony. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And with that, we'll proceed with our witnesses. First, Mr. Watts, you may proceed, but I've seen your bio here. You're a graduate of the University of Pittsburgh. So are you a native of Western Pennsylvania or just attended graduate school there?
No, I finished graduate school.
All right, that's great. You don't have that Pittsburghese accent, or at least I didn't pick up on it yet.
My dad joined the Air Corps.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for being here today. And I don't know if your mic is on. Push the button is. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
There you go. There you go. And you proceed, please.
Well, Chairman Shuster, Mr. Larson, members of the panel, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to testify. I just want to make a couple quick comments about caveats for the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments report that we put out earlier in the year. We focused pretty much on prime contractors and major defense acquisition programs in that particular report. As a very small think tank, we have very little capacity to do the sort of thing that Bert Lambert's trying to do over in the Pentagon, and that's go down to the lower tiers and the parts suppliers and even the materials suppliers. That's an enormous job, and a small group like ours, it's just beyond what we can do. We also didn't say much about some of the ITAR constraints, the legislative constraints that make it difficult for the defense industrial base to access the global defense economy, as Jack Gansler talked about at great length in his recent book, Democracy's Arsenal. Beyond that, I'll just make a couple of comments about the three pieces that were in my written statement. First of all, and I'm not going to say much about this, I think here in Congress it's clear that this is not a normal free market economy when we talk about the defense industrial base. It's very different than consumer electronics or the automobile industry. It's highly regulated. The regulators and the customer are one and the same, the U.S. government, and there are piles and piles of regulations and statutes that try to make the business processes as low risk as possible when you do, particularly when you do major programs. And I would certainly suggest that whatever can be done to try to relieve some of that burden would be useful going forward. Given the present fiscal situation that the Pentagon's facing, they've had almost a decade of growing budgets, they had supplementals, and now the base defense budget is surely going to start going down and will probably go down for a period of time into the future. Given that, I think it's essential for the Pentagon and the U.S. government writ large to develop a coherent long-term strategy for deciding what pieces of the defense industrial base are really going to be important going forward over the next several decades, and make some real strategic choices. We talked in the report about 6 or 7 or 8 major areas which we think should be invested in preferentially. We did not give you or suggest a list of what those are, but we think if you're going to have a strategy, insofar as strategy is about choice, that you're going to have to focus on capability areas that are probably in the single digits. If you end up with 75 or 123 most important things, you just don't have a strategy. And it's very difficult, given the interests of the various here on the Hill and Congress, the various services and constituencies in industry, to not end up with a very large list. So I think making that choice going forward is really critical. Let me just say that it's not easy. You need to start with the challenges that we will face from a national security standpoint over the next several decades. And that's going to be difficult enough, figuring out what the really 7 or 8 or maybe 9 really important areas are. Then secondly, if we could get some consensus on what those are, there is the problem of deciding what pieces of the industrial base, the defense industrial base, would really support those capabilities going forward. I mentioned in my statement anti-access area denial capabilities, and if you thought that was important, that was an area we really ought to invest in preferentially. There's a whole range of different options that you could choose. You could buy more Aegis cruisers for missile, or emphasize missile defense. You might want to invest long-term in directed energy. You might think more about submersibles, combatants. There are a whole range of things. And both those choices, deciding what the really important threats to pay attention to over the next several decades and deciding what pieces of the industrial base are really critical to supporting them, those are difficult choices. And with that, I will end. My 5 minutes are up.
Thank you very much, Mr. Watts. And with that, Mr. Downey.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Larson, distinguished members of the panel, it's a real pleasure for me to be here as a representative of more than 350 companies who are part of the Aerospace and Defense Industrial Base. The week of September 12th was National Aerospace Week by congressional resolution. During that week, we celebrated our legacy of global leadership in aviation, defense, and space. In the coming months, several momentous decisions will be made about the nation's budget, which will ultimately affect what kind of aerospace and defense industrial base we will have, what capabilities it will possess, and whether or not we will remain the global leaders. Those decisions will be taken in the absence of an industrial-based strategy, and if history repeats itself without full participation of those who must manage the industrial base during what is a time of historic reorganization. I think most Americans would agree that the 20th century was defined by aerospace and that it was largely our century because we were second to none in aerospace. I think the 21st century will also be defined by aerospace, and the question is whether we're still going to be second to none. While most accept that the industrial base is a national strategic asset, too many choose to treat it with benign neglect, assuming that the free market will always work to ensure we stay second to none. As Mr. Watts said, although it never really was a free market, it was so successful that many believe it is now a national birthright. But that was then. The industrial base that existed then doesn't exist today. It's a far cry from the military-industrial complex of the Eisenhower era. In the 20 years since the Cold War, nearly 150 significant defense companies have consolidated to 6. A number of big companies left the market. Almost none have entered it. And the post-Cold War consolidation has created a situation where the top firms have grown individually, but the market has shrunk significantly. So far from being the powerhouse that many suggest, the combined annual revenue of the top 7 members of the aerospace and defense industrial base today is about 1/2 of the annual revenue of Walmart. That's how it's changed since the days of the Cold War. If these trends continue and the defense budget continues to be cut, the capability to deliver critical militarily unique systems will atrophy, and the capability our troops and the American people expect might not be available. We have to have the capability to design, develop, produce, and support complex systems. And that requires having programs to work on. If we don't, the companies that make up our industrial base can't continue to invest in the workforce, plant, and research that might be needed. The impact will be felt first on our workforce. We have only half the workers we did 30 years ago, and the recession and budget reductions already have further reduced that amount. Recent analysis performed by Dr. Fuller at George Mason University and others finds that the total American job loss for just the first part of the Budget Control Act will be approximately 430,000 jobs, and about 1/3 of those jobs will be from the defense, aerospace, and industrial base. But it's not just jobs we're going to lose. It's a valuable human capital. The most brilliant and ambitious technicians, engineers, and scientists have sought to work for the industry. But we're facing increased competition from other high-tech sectors for those workers. Without the challenges, we're not going to get there. we need two things. We need budgets that produce programs that are profitable and that reach out to the talent we need. And we need an industrial-based strategy that gives direction and predictability that the industry leaders need to make sound strategic business decisions. Without those two things, it's doubtful whether we'll have the aerospace and defense industrial base that's provided the capability that our soldiers, sailors, and airmen and the American people have come to expect. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Shuster, Mr. Larson, members of the panel, thank you for inviting me. As was noted, I'm a senior associate at CSIS. I'm also a managing partner at Renaissance Strategic Advisors, so I'm not only a student of the industry, sort of a practitioner in it. You are asking a great question in terms, and an important one, particularly given the budget environment that we're entering in. However, it's a question that you need to, I think, approach with caution, because one of the worst things that one can apply when it comes to defense industrial policy is a one-size-fits-all mentality. In fact, more damage has been done to the industry by trying to apply these one-size-fits-all policies. We would suggest that thinking about the industry as a whole in sort of three constituent parts: the emerging technologies and companies, think cyber, think directed energy, think mobile applications, the new technologies of today as one sort of group that has its own issues and topics. You then have the core part of the market, or the mature part, the constituents of Mr. Downey, the Lockheeds, the Northrops, the Boeings of the world, and their supplier base, to Mr. Larson's point that there's a whole small business community. And then there's a much more mature legacy component. Those are the remaining sort of monopoly or duopoly manufacturers of, for example, the shipbuilders, space launch, where I'm down to one major supplier, fixed-wing aircraft, where I'm down to two, tank manufacturing, where I'm down to one. The policy issues and the contracting issues are different. On the emerging sort of category, this is where technology is important, access to technological talent. The issue that we have in our schools with science and technology is a critical issue. They can't find enough scientists. Export controls is absolutely critical to this category, where we're not getting inside the technology because people are afraid to put technology in the U.S. because they can't get it back out again, has become a serious issue. The lack of venture capital, and even the overall environment for these small emerging companies operating in a budgetary environment, frankly, under continuing resolutions. It's very hard for these young companies to sort of enter and come in and do things. The other thing that's very important to think about when you're thinking about policies relative to these, don't shut down competition too early. In this part of the segment, you like having 8, 9, 10 different players because we're still trying to figure out what's the right technology. Think about what the aircraft industry looked like in the 1920s, where I had 8 or 9, 10 different companies. They were making airplanes with 3 wings, 2 wings, engines in the front and the back. We didn't know which one was the right way. You can think of the UAV industry today as the same one. The Orville and Wilbur Wrights of the 21st century are playing in the new space launch markets and the UAVs. Shutting off competition too early is actually dangerous. Preservation of the science and technology budgets is critical for this constituency. So the 6163 budgets, funding to places like DARPA are sort of the lubricant and the thing that keeps this part of the industrial base vital and alive. In the mature part of the core part of the supplier base, these again are the Lockheed Martins, the Northrop Grummans, the General Dynamics, the Boeings of the world. They represent, frankly, the jobs that we have in our districts today, and in many cases they're in some of the most sort of underrepresented areas. And their supplier base underneath them are sort of represent the mainstay. Here, this is where the core questions about DoD acquisition processes, how difficult is it, how much overhead burdens are we putting on them with unneeded processes and others. This is where the call for strategy and focus that Mr. Watts and Mr. Downey called for is going to be absolutely critical. They can figure their way out as long as they know where we're going, right? And then in the absence of a strategy, it becomes too easy for some of them to sit there and say, just like they did in the 1990s, this is too difficult, I'm going to go home, I'm going to go somewhere else. Great example, and we also have to remember that defense is a small market for some of these. We went through untold pain related to the tanker program, for example, over about 160 airplanes. In the end, that represents about 10 weeks worth of production for Boeing and Airbus. right? So keeping that in mind in terms of we deal with that. The legacy one is probably one of the most complex for you because it represents core capabilities. Tanks, submarines, aircraft, space launch, critical capabilities where we have an advantage, but we're down to a very small set of suppliers, and frankly, it sometimes takes a lot of money in order to keep that core capability set. And here we just need to decide which ones are core capability sets that we want to continue and where we need to put in sufficient engineering and money to sustain engineering talent versus who is the last buggy whip manufacturer and actually should go away because they're in the more legacy side of it. And so from that perspective, the issue of making sure that there is enough money to sustain that old legacy set of capabilities until the new emerging guys rise becomes one of the most critical questions. This is really important for the small suppliers because I think where you'll find the most amount of vulnerability is in the last propeller manufacturer for the U.S. Navy, for example, or there's an example of, it turns out the last maker of linen bags for artillery shells also does habits for nuns. And the nuns decided to pull their contract, and now suddenly the U.S. Navy is worried about who's going to make the last set of linen bags for their artillery shells. You're going to find all sorts of strange, bizarre pockets of the industry that are actually absolutely critical and important. And so from that perspective, the policies that work at one end of the industry don't work at the other. So as you go through your work, which I commend highly, it's the right sets of questions, think through those buckets and the impact that it has across those different parts of the industry. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chow, could you talk a little bit more about the technology, the emerging companies, and the technology, we're keeping it out of DoD. We heard in one of our hearings where, because of the ITAR regulations, that it's very difficult once you have a technology that's now it's in the open market, but our folks providing the DoD can't sell it commercially now, so it really constrains them. So what you're suggesting are people that are saying, I'm not even going to start selling to the United States government because they're going to capture this and I'm going to be hamstrung.
This is it's one of the thorniest topics on the landscape in terms of export control reform. I know this committee and Congress and the administration have been looking at this topic. We have the beginnings of a lot of strange unintended consequences because of the way the policy has been put into place, right? It's been logically been put into place in order to prevent core American technology from leaking out to adversaries. It's having the unintended consequences, the way it's being implemented, where companies are afraid to put the technology into the U.S. and are keeping it outside. You're seeing this mostly in very cutting-edge telecommunications technologies. I'm aware of at least 2 instances where global companies have decided to sell off their U.S.-related businesses in order to be able to compete globally because it was, again, too difficult. You're beginning to hear other countries about developing products that are quote-unquote ITAR-free. And when you talk to those companies, and CSIS did a big study on this, these are countries and companies that said we would have gladly bought American had we been allowed to. Since we weren't, we had to build our own set of technologies. So we have to figure out a way to reconcile that core need of making sure that our core technology doesn't go out while mitigating some of these unintended consequences. And I would argue those unintended consequences are rising at such a level that it's getting to crisis levels where addressing this issue, I think, is going to be absolutely critical.
And then you talked about shutting off competition. Where is that occurring? I mean, how is that occurring? It's more.
It's not occurring yet, but as we go into a tighter budget environment, it's going to become very easy to sit there and take a look at that list and say, boy, I'm running 10 UAV competitions or programs. Maybe I should just go to 1, right? And all I'm saying is 10 to 8 is probably okay. 10 to 1 would be disastrous because we're still trying to figure out that technology, for example. In others where the answer is becoming more evident, just like it occurred with the aircraft industry, where we settled on a common solution, a single wing monocoque hull, and others, it's okay to narrow down.
Right. Thank you. The Department of Defense just came out with a report talking about long-term investments, short-term, strategically looking at, I think, Mr. Watts, you talked about that. But the report is almost schizophrenic. It talks about those things being important, yet it's going to allow the market to continue to drive our needs or to provide for our needs. And you're saying in your report that we need some kind of strategic plan moving forward to keep, as Mr. Chow said, some of our legacy, some of our other core competencies. Is that? Did you see the report at all?
Yes, I have looked at it.
Your assessment is?
Well, it seems to continue to assume that this industry operates like consumer electronics or the automobile industry, and if that's not the case, then trying to develop a strategy based on an incorrect assumption, an incorrect understanding of the nature of what they're trying to manage and develop a strategy for is probably not going to succeed. Gansler, going all the way back to 80, pointed out that because of the acceptance of that assumption, that incorrect assumption that it's a normal free market and competition will really work the same as it does in consumer electronics or flat screen TVs, the policies based on that assumption have generally done more harm than good. So now, in fairness to that report, they did talk about the service aspects of defense acquisition as opposed to major weapon systems. And the use of competition may be more useful in the services end of defense procurement. So there's a point to be made there in terms of the way they structured the report, but still the assumption about the nature of the industry, just as far as I can tell, has been wrong since the 50s.
Right. And Mr. Downey, you concur with that for the most part, some of your testimony?
Yeah, I do entirely. I think competition certainly ought to be used for those sectors of the industry where it may be effective. Electronics is a key area, but there's not going to be much competition for a nuclear submarine or a long-range bomber. There just aren't enough companies in the market. So you can't have classic competition in some core capabilities, and I think the challenge for the Pentagon is to understand the difference and construct a strategy that's adequate to deal with the differences, as Pierre has said.
And I fully intend at some point we'll have the folks from the DoD in front of us to ask us why they believe that this can be market-driven to provide us with all when it's clear on most people to look at it, and when you look at it as just common sense, is DoD is the regulator, they're the procurer, there's just one U.S. Department of Defense. Why do you think in their minds that they're just kicking the can down the road because we've got fiscal financial restraints?
I'm just puzzled by why that has persisted as long as it has. That's all I can say.
Right.
It seems to be a myth at best. Perhaps it's just, we look at the really normal market commercial parts of our industry. We think competition and innovation are very important, and we just sort of assume that it's pretty much the same in the defense industry on the one hand. On the other hand, if you look at down select from a RFP to move into development of a program, most of the competition ends at that point, notwithstanding the essentially the direction in law from that 2009 Reform Act, which suggested that the Secretary of Defense should try to maintain competition throughout the life of programs. It just hasn't been happening, and the best example is the second engine for the Joint Strike Fighter. If you go back and review the reasons the Secretary Gates gave for not going ahead with that, it was basically the trade-off between the real upfront $2.7 billion or so of real cost to develop the engine and the more theoretical benefits of the long-term, actually being able to compete two engines over the lifespan of that airplane, which they judged as more theoretical and ephemeral and just didn't think it was worth the $2.7 billion.
Mr. Chairman, if I might add, I think part of the answer to your question is simply not watching what's happening to the market in general. In the 50s and 60s, when we were designing 10 aircraft and producing 6, competition made sense. When you have a market of only 1 or 2 actual producers today and no real prospect in a very capital-intensive sector of attracting new competitors into the market, then you have to look at something different, and that's a hard thing to do. It's much easier simply to assume that competition will give you the innovation and go forward.
I would also submit to you, again, it's the difference between these different segments. So when the Pentagon writes that report, they're looking at some of the emerging technologies. If you were to put an RFP out today and say, I need a cyber solution, or I want to put a PDA in every soldier's hands, I guarantee you're going to get a lot of competition, and a lot of people show up. That's not who they're representing. That's not who they're talking to. To sit there and say, I want competition in tank manufacturing is silly. Right? We haven't designed a new one. I've got a very good supplier. I'm down to one, and I'd be wasting money because that's more of a negotiated relationship as opposed to where you can have an open arm's length relationship in again, some services, newer technologies. That works fine, and that's where I think you have also the schizophrenia of the report, because they're talking about that part of the industry. I would suspect that most of the people that you hear talking about the pain that's going on inside the defense industry is from the more legacy part of the industry that's down to that narrow base.
Thank you. Mr. Larson?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just an observation in the first 8 to 10 years of this decade, when there seemed to be relative plenty in the defense budget, we're getting the same complaints. So fiscal restraint is here and coming, and we have the same complaints. Sort of gets to Mr. Watt's point. I wasn't here in the 50s, but I'll take your word for it, that the complaints were the same. There's always never enough money, and there's always plenty of bad ideas being brought to the government for funding, as well as good ideas. And our goal here is to be sure the good ideas, no matter where they come from, get a hearing to increase the opportunities for our warfighters to get the products and services and support that they need. One example, and I think this is an interesting, I guess I'd ask Mr. Chow and Mr. Downey this question, has to do with satellites. There is a new entrant in the market who is seeking to become a competitor in the defense side of the business, and but the core part, as you would describe it, the core part of the industry, I won't say that they don't want that competitor, but the rules are set up to encourage, to support the core part of the industry and to seemingly discourage the new entrant. It has to do with the SpaceX versus the Boeing and the satellite on the satellite side. So how do we bridge that? How do we bridge that problem as an example? I didn't come here to talk about this in particular, but it's a perfect example where you have a new and emerging entrant who actually wants to now jump the gap to become a competitor in a larger program.
That's a great example. You can take those and again, you can pit the classic aircraft manufacturers against the UAV manufacturers, the light vehicle. I mean, each one of these sectors has players in each place. Part of it is driven by the policy and the technological solutions that the Pentagon wants to go after. If the core way that we're going to do our satellites is large, sort of monolith, multi-billion-dollar satellites to carry capabilities, it's going to be very hard to give that to a small startup, and it will drift itself towards there. A policy suggestion or things that some people have suggested is that while you're keeping that core legacy, ensuring that there is a certain amount of money preserved for the technological innovation amongst the younger ones. Is money worth spending as the hedge, and in order to usher along some of these newer technologies? In markets where there's a large commercial market, the commercial market will do that for the Pentagon, right? In places where it's a little harder and there isn't a big market space, you happen to pick one. Would sit there and say that it's probably too early to hand it over to that young startup, so I want to keep my core, but on the other hand, you're probably going to want to usher along some of these new guys to see what the new technology is.
Mr. Downey?
I think it's a great question, and we're going to have to figure out how to integrate new, innovative ways of building capabilities that we built before. But in general, a great idea isn't a capability. A capability is the ability to design, develop, produce, and support a system throughout its life cycle, and to build the skilled workforce that can do those things. Our policies today are to buy fewer and fewer pieces of equipment, have fewer programs with far more time between new program starts. It's very, very difficult to sustain that life cycle capability in that kind of environment. Most small companies don't have the staying power or the resources to be able to do that. So having a one-time capability to compete for one thing doesn't necessarily mean you sustain the capability in terms of a unique military capability.
But that's one of the challenges facing smaller companies in general, that longer lead time. So again, it's a process that plays against them, as opposed to encouraging newer entrants into even the smaller niche areas of the defense budget. And something that we heard from folks, and certainly in my district, and from other places as well. So I think accepting that as a reality is part of what we don't want to do here. We want to accept that as a challenge for the Pentagon to change, so as a way to encourage smaller and medium-sized businesses into maybe we can help define what's an appropriate market and what's a not appropriate market too, and help them along. We'll hear from folks next week on this point. The point you made about the aerospace defense industrial base today is not the one of the past, but that we need budgets that produce programs that are profitable and stable. I don't want to put words in your mouth. I think from your members' point of view and from the current market's point of view, clearly stable contracts that help provide a profit to the business is a good idea from your side of things, and probably the number one priority. Despite the brochures, our number one priority is the warfighter and making sure they get the services and products and things that we're asking, so they can do the things we're asking them to do. Where those match, it's a great idea. Where they don't match, I'd rather see us prevail. That is, I'd rather see the Pentagon prevail, so that we're getting the services first. But if we do that, then that may not help you all prevail. And so, trying to find the sweet spot where folks are coming and saying we need programs that are profitable. Frankly, we have to say, well, we want programs that work and they work on time, and you're responsible for that too.
Well, I don't think there's any difference in what we're saying at all. If you have a strategy, you know where you're going, you have predictability and stability, and you have a reasonable way to do strategic business planning that satisfies your shareholders. And we have to remember that the members of the Aerospace and Defense Industrial Base are largely private companies. Mm-hmm. They are not government companies.
Right.
If they don't meet the expectations of return on investment, and here's an expert on that, then their boards are going to force them into more profitable areas. So the more predictability and stability you have, the better opportunity to calculate that critical return on investment, and the stability allows you to build those things that work, that are on time, and that are on the contracted price. The more instability you have, we would say, the less likelihood that you're going to get an era where you don't see cost increases and schedule slippages. So we've got to get to the point where we have that understanding of what's wanted, when it's wanted, and it isn't changed on an annual basis or when a chief of service or a new administration turns a critical must-have into a nice-to-have but expendable.
Yeah. The other challenge, if I may, Mr. Chairman, the other challenge we all obviously face is, and we've heard from other folks, is another solution is the board decides to go out and purchase that smaller company, right? They go out and purchase the capability and bring it in-house themselves, which is a challenge we've heard from other folks. Is how do we help maintain an incentive structure so the independence and smallness and innovation side of these small and medium-sized businesses stays independent and innovative, as opposed to getting sucked into become a division or subsidiary of a company.
And that's partly been driven by the lack of visibility in the market space, right? The large companies have cut independent research and development down from about 5% of their revenues to about 1.5%. And they've been substituting M&A for that research and development because in the absence of knowing where the building wants to go, the only thing they can do is watch that little guy succeed, and at least they know that, hey, they're buying from that guy, so I'll pull them in, right? And the other thing about the profitability, just one quick point there, this is the only market space where the customer would gladly pay $1 billion at 8% margin rather than $500 million at 20% margins, right? It's completely turned around. And that mentality sort of creates a lot of, I think, these perverse sort of disincentives for innovation, new entrants, et cetera. And so as you hear proposals for, reforming the system, just be very careful in watching carefully about those the assault on the profits, which I can understand from a political standpoint, actually is going to end up generating the exact opposite. The industry would gladly trade lower dollars for higher profits each time, but for some reason that's not in the mix, right?
Yeah, right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Runyon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and gentlemen, thank you for coming and your testimony. I just really have one question. We talk about the industrial base in this country, how it's, frankly, I look at it as the last major form of industry we have left here that's solely done here, and how we keep that. And Mr. Downey, you've said, obviously, we need to have some confidence and projection forward in how we can keep to procure stuff like this. My one thing, and I don't think it gets enough traction, and I think it's really directly linked, is the turn we've actually taken in space exploration associated with defense. Can you kind of talk, because I know there's a lot of one-offs and small suppliers that are involved in that industry. Can you kind of touch on that a little bit?
We are concerned about the space industrial base, especially as it relates to the National Defense Space Industrial Base. There's some good news. There is an emergence of commercial space companies. Some of them are, in fact, our members, and we look for great things for them. But I would make the same case. Space is an expensive proposition. The return on investment right now is somewhat problematic, and we need the government strategy that keeps us moving forward on the cutting edge of technology. There have been many who said they'd bet you a lot that the next boots on the moon are going to be Chinese, and I'm not sure that they're wrong. Only the government, only NASA and the Pentagon can have the kind of vision that translates into programs that builds the capabilities. And then as the commercial companies build their capabilities, I think they'll be serious members of the United States space industrial base. But we risk losing some critical parts. We don't have a heavy lift capability. Our satellite capability is atrophying. Everybody knows what the situation is with our manned space program. Right now, we're dependent on the Russians to get to the space station. And the capability will atrophy. It will. And the small companies that make up the supplier base won't have the majors to sell to. They'll turn to something else, and then we'll have to start again.
And I think even looking forward and planning, and we hear it testimony all the time, that even when the DOD tries to project what's going to happen in the QDR or whatever, that changes tomorrow. So it's, in a way, it's kind of an oxymoron to go back and forth. We're planning for the future, but the future changed yesterday after we already put the report out. So I understand the frustrating aspect of it, but to help us, nail down a way to keep the industrial base here, and it was a frustrating proposition. So thank you, and I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Runyon. And with that, Ms. Hanabusa, I believe you're up next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to thank the chair and the ranking member for taking us to Rock Island. It was a very interesting adventure for someone from Hawaii to actually see a working foundry. I think I'd like to start first with Mr. Downey. And Mr. Downey, I was reviewing your publication, Defense Investment, Finding the Right Balance, and you say things like, how much is enough? Which is an interesting concept of how much is enough. But I think the problem that I see that we are having is the fact that when we talk about the defense industrial base, right, we have, some of us think about things like R&D, because we know that the big 7 or the big 5, as you say, in 1993, 30 companies went down to 5 in essence. And then we forget that the other component of it is truly an industrial base. In other words, like the foundry, who then manufactures. But then we have this conflict of how do we decide what's going to be manufactured because of what we're developing. And it comes down to really a sense of what is, from our perspective, the defense going to look like, or the military is going to look like into the future. And I know each of you have your different areas, so can you tell me, each one of you, beginning with Mr. Downey, you can go to Mr. Chow and then Mr. Watts afterwards, what is that fundamental end goal that we're looking at? You might call it end strength, I'm talking about people, but what is that end goal we're looking at? And let's just take it 10 years out to 2021. What are we planning for? Because until we have a clear view of that, how can we then decide enough is enough, or when is enough enough? Is 4.4% of GDP enough? And how do we spend that money? And how do we keep the industrial base, which is manufacturing, and the research and development when we go from 30 to 5?
Ms. Hanabusa, I think there, I'd attack this as 2 parts. One is that we do need a strategy to decide what we want our military to do in the future, what forces we need to do it, and what technologies and weapons we want to provide them to do it. That's frankly supposed to be the job of the QDR. It's not done a terrific job there. So that's about getting down to what specifically we're going to do and what we need. The report you talked about was one where we looked at the issue from a macro level and said the United States since mid-20th century has been a global power with global responsibilities and global reach. that we've ended up with a military a relative size of about 1.5 million active. And when we looked at the budgets over time and the ups and downs of the budgets, what we found was that in order to have that global military with global reach and global responsibilities, every time we came down much below 4% of GDP and at the same time reduce the investment accounts to much below 35% of that top line, we ended up with a hall of force, whatever the specific goals, whatever the specific forces were. And so I think it's back to a point I made earlier. You have to make those choices, but you have to have adequate resources. And so we started with the assumption that the United States is going to remain a global power with a global force with global responsibilities. And we looked at an interesting point, too, that increasingly that 1.5 million looks smaller and smaller to do all of those things. So we've had a historical policy of using the technology advantage we've had, and so the amount of money that it takes to field one of those 1.5 million is going to keep increasing in the future. You're not going to reduce that requirement. So, number one, we do need to know where we're going. That's a national level political decision. We need to know how we're going to do it militarily. That's ultimately a professional military recommendation with a national political decision. But it's going to need the resources, and we believe at AIA that those resources are probably not going to fall much below 4% of GDP or 35% of that top line for investment, whatever those decisions are, or those plans are going to end up being hollowed out in one way or another. And the resourcing part is a congressional responsibility and decision.
Mr. Chair, I'm out of time, so could the other gentleman send it in writing to me? Thank you very much.
With that, Mr. West. And also mention members, we'll probably go for another round if you have any more questions, because I know I have a couple more.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member, and thanks to the panel for being here. And I spent a couple of days in the military, and a lot of the frustrations I saw, especially when you look at FCS program, Crusader, F-22, Advanced Amphibious Assault Vehicle. In the last 20 years, we've gone from 546 Navy war vessels down to 285. But yet 10 years ago, about 19 guys got together. We spent $1.5 million on a Tomahawk cruise missile. They hijacked 4 airplanes and they flew them into buildings. We have programs like the Jitters and WinNet, which the Army is saying that's one of their top requirements for communications, but yet we're not funding it. I'd like to ask this question, your assessment. Do you really believe that there is a huge disconnect between a national security strategy, national military strategy, and then, of course, the requirements we send down to a defense industrial base so that we can start developing a sensing of the next 20 to 30 to maybe 40 years of this military that we have to be able to fight against, what is a very determined enemy that is not that much technologically advanced. So I'd like to hear your assessment on that, and then what can we do to rectify that situation?
All right, I'll take a stab at that one.
Can you pull your mic a little closer to you, Mr. Pull your microphone a little closer to you.
Oh, okay. Is that good enough? Okay. Look, let me just mention one very broad capability that we've had really since the Second World War, and that's overseas power projection of conventional forces. Associated with that, one of the pieces that we've developed, certainly over the last couple decades, has been long-range precision strike. And frankly, since Desert Storm, we've had almost a monopoly in that area. Now, one of the problems going forward is that technology is starting to proliferate, at least at the short-end range, guided mortars, guided artillery, guided short-range missiles. And that's going to make power projection much more difficult for us if you think in terms of, say, something like the Ingchong in 1950, traditional over-the-beach amphibious assault. So that would suggest we're going to have to make some substantial changes and adjustments. I would be hard-pressed to think that we would like to get out of the precision strike business. I think that's an area which is fundamentally dependent on networking, on ISR, advanced capabilities that we have spent a lot of money and time and effort developing, and that in a broad sense, you wouldn't want to back out of that particular business long term. Given the fact that the Chinese, for example, are going fairly fast down the same path in developing anti-access area denial capabilities against, say, surface combatant and aircraft carrier reaching out to ranges as far away from the Chinese coast as Guam, suggests that the future of the carrier battle group may be at risk. We've depended on that for overseas presence and power projection for a long time. Those are hard choices that I think the services are going to have to make. So let me just mention that as one. Another area that I know is not conventional, but to think about where our nuclear capabilities have gone over since the Cold War ended. It would be nice if we could get, in my lifetime, to a world without nuclear weapons. I'm personally fairly skeptical. I don't think we've convinced too many others around the planet who possess nuclear weapons that it's time to give them up and that they no longer have value. And that's an area of the industrial base where we've preserved the design capabilities at Lawrence Livermore and Los Alamos. But as I'm sure you're aware, Secretary Gates and Secretary Bodeman, who was at Energy going back in 2009, basically observed we no longer have production capabilities for a nuclear weapon. That's an area where if you really wanted to go back into that business, you'd have to start over again.
One quick comment. As long as we have a requirements and acquisition system that takes 20, 25 years to get something from concept to actually out in the field, you're going to have always a fundamental disconnect between strategy and what we're buying. Right? In 1900, they were planning against the war against, the Germans or the French or the Brits, potentially. By 1920, right, we had just fought the Germans. By 1940, fighting them again. By 1960, it's the Russians. By 1980, they're at the top. By 2000, it's 4 guys in an airplane. By 2020, to your question, Ms. Hannibus, who knows, right? And so shrinking, looking at again, in terms of your reform efforts, looking at shortening that cycle can only be a good thing from the perspective of getting that mismatch out of the way. And oh, by the way, shorter cycle, which means more points of competition, more programs, is very healthy for an industry. One program every 20 years is really unhealthy for an industry.
Would you repeat the last thing you said? I couldn't.
I'm sorry.
Just the last couple sentences.
One program. If I'm running one program for 20 years, that's very unhealthy for an industry, versus versus not. This whole element of how long it takes us to get a weapon system is really one of these core root cause elements, and we solved part of that problem in the way we did acquisition for the war, because it created a really quick pull and we had very quick turns, right? And so I have a healthy base related to that. It's the other part of the system which you guys are looking at from a reform standpoint. I think that's part of the fundamental issue.
Quick comment, Mr. West. I think as an old soldier myself, I sympathize with your frustrations. Had them as well. One thing that personally I'd be leery to do is predict too precisely who we're going to fight, where we're going to fight, with what we're going to fight, and when we're going to do it. Historically, we've always been wrong when we've done that too much. So part of the problem, I think, is retaining the capability we need. We're not going to end up buying everything that's wanted or designed, but when the system gets to the point that you described, the possibility is we won't buy much of anything, as Pierre said, and the capability to do that will atrophy and migrate away, and we're just not going to be able to reconstitute some of that. Some of it will be very expensive. Some of it may not be recoverable at all.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Sutton.
Thank you.
Thank you for your leadership, and to the ranking member, thank you as well. Gentlemen, thank you for your testimony. I have great concern, as I'm sure everyone here does, of the consequences of the atrophy that you describe. I tend to believe that if you can't make it, you are at the mercy of those who can, which is not a good place for the United States of America to be. So this is so very, very important. Mr. Downey, on page 5 of your testimony, you talk about other nations, including our closest allies, comprehend these realities, and thus they've adopted systematic, comprehensive policies to sustain what they consider to be strategic national assets. Can you expand on that for me? Tell me who and what.
Yeah. Most major industrial nations do have an industrial base strategy for their defense. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's exceedingly successful and effective in all cases, but France does, United Kingdom does, Germany does, I believe China does, but the key that they tend to focus on is what capabilities from a national standpoint they want to retain. Mm-hmm. They don't always get it right, but at least it's part of their process. The British have the process of the defense white paper system, which includes defense white papers. We do not include industrial-based considerations in our strategic planning historically. In the most recent QDR, there's exactly one paragraph about industrial base, and nobody in the industrial base that I'm aware of participated in even developing that one paragraph, let alone a strategy. Yet I sat in a meeting in London a couple of years ago where the then British Defense Minister met with the senior leaders of the British defense industry and outlined where he was going to go, saying that he had heard their concerns and that he was going to take care of part of that by including in the strategy an effective outreach program for foreign sales. Mm. Now, that may not be a complete strategy, but it's at least a somewhat coherent one, and one which we don't have as a coherent one.
Well, I appreciate your answer. There are so many questions. Let me ask you this. I mean, clearly, I think that maintaining a stable and strong and nimble, industrial policy is critically important. You talked about the need for the strategic plan. I think the second component that you really focused in on was communication. And if you could just speak to the need for, you say, much better communication and coordination between the Pentagon and industry than has been our historical norm. In a nutshell, what do we do?
Yeah, in a nutshell, as I said, historically, we haven't done much of it for almost a 10-year period during the first decade. To my knowledge, there wasn't one meeting between the Secretary of Defense and the collective leaders of the U.S. Aerospace and defense industry. That's been turned around. Former Secretary Gates and current Secretary Panetta has begun to meet with the leaders of the aerospace and defense industry, and the industry's reciprocated by forming an industrial-based task force to look at the impacts. Mm-hmm. With the hope that we can help the Pentagon if they so choose, but it's even if they develop an industrial-based strategy, if they do it without industry, it'd be like having a naval strategy without talking to the Chief of Naval Operations.
Well, the one question I have, as you talk about even if all of those improvements take place, if we make progress there, we still have the issue that this panel has seen over and over again dealing with the communication into smaller and mid-size providers. So can you speak to that issue as well? Because when you say industry, I'm guessing you're not talking about them. You're talking about
no.
You are talking about.
I am.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, in our association, for example, we have a supplier management council that includes members of the supply base, and that is represented on our executive committee by one of their leaders, currently Chuck Gray from a small company. So their considerations are included in all of the work that we do and all of the advocacy we do with the Pentagon and elsewhere.
If you have further questions, you can go. We'll start the second round with you right now if you have. That would be great. Sure.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. When you talk about you specifically mentioned some capabilities that you see atrophying from the heavy lift capability, the satellite capability, and the manned space capabilities. Part of the challenge I face, and maybe others do, is how do you quantify what that means to us?
Well, we're working on trying to get a better handle on the impacts. One thing we do know that the first part of that life cycle that begins to atrophy is the design capability. As a program matures, the company who's making the product has less and less need for the people who do design, and so. If they don't have other places to put them or other programs that require design, then they're going to get rid of them. And there are a number of design teams that have been reduced or that have actually been disbanded because there's no work for them. And it goes back to which ones do we not want to have that happen to? I would probably suggest that right now we wouldn't want to lose our capability to design a nuclear submarine. The British went down that road and found they couldn't reconstitute that capability, and when about a dozen years later they decided they need it. And so I would hope the Pentagon is looking at that much more carefully to decide which of those capabilities and which of the skills represented by the people that may be lost if the budget is decremented too much, they absolutely have to have, and then come up with plans to do it. And in some cases, that may not seem the most cost-effective thing program by program, but on a national security basis, it might be the most cost-effective thing to do.
Well, I share the frustration over the idea that every expenditure. It's interesting what we're seeing in budgeting here, that anything that doesn't appear as an expenditure is obviously an efficiency, and that isn't necessarily the truth. And so this whole concept of life cycles and the cost of not investing, the cost of not doing things, and I think that is what we really need to help translate in order to get some more sense back into the way we're proceeding, not just in this in the industrial base and certainly DoD, but frankly, infrastructure. The cost of not building infrastructure is not zero. It's still there, and it's going to maybe be more costly and more inefficient. So anybody else have any comment?
Just going to make a comment that, to your question, in the absence of a defense industrial strategy, we're actually making one up by every acquisition decision we make. It is getting done, so we should just stop lying to ourselves and admit that we're doing it and get to it. Because also in the absence of that strategy, and I'll say something incendiary that'll probably get me into trouble, but in the absence of figuring out what is strategically important to us, we focus on very strange things. So I have a very detailed industrial base strategy related to black berets, but I don't have one related to semiconductors. Right. And the Chinese have set up a policy where they're drawing in every technology in, where it would almost be fiduciarily irresponsible for an executive not to put their plant into China, right, because of the incentives they set up, and we're letting it drift away. And so I think you're hitting exactly on the right point about what's strategically important. And if we don't get to it, we're going to find out that capability's gone.
And if I could just add to that, in the kind of fiscal environment that the Pentagon faces now, and the Department of Homeland Security and other parts of the U.S. government, the tendency is to start focusing on individual programs and sort of addressing the question of, well, how much can I cut this one? Can I eliminate that one? And it seems to me, from a strategic standpoint, you first want to decide what you really want to keep. And we haven't been doing very well at that. Just to touch on the point that Mr. West mentioned earlier, if you look at the last 3 or 4 or 5 national security strategy documents, they tend fundamentally, in my judgment, to be wish lists without getting on to the difficult issues of exactly how are we going to get from point A to point C or point D. And so I think they have not been that helpful in addressing these kinds of issues about what we want to keep.
Thank you. About Mr. West.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Coming back to what we talked about with the acquisition cycles, one of the things that I know that the Army has instituted is something called the Rapid Equipping Force. A good buddy of mine is heading that up. So what are your recommendations, things that we can look at, things that we could do, things that we could push for coming from this panel and from the Armed Services Committee as far as how do we shorten that acquisition cycle and how do we get more of these emerging technologies and companies involved so that we can be, a bit more adaptive, because the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines are quite adaptive on the battlefield. But it seems that we up here on this aspect in the industry, we are not as quickly responding and as adaptive. So,
you've hit a great topic. We have painfully learned those lessons over the last decade. One of the biggest things I think you need to watch as a group is the tendency that once we're gone to have forgotten those lessons. In fact, 200 years of history says we will forget those lessons and go back to our old habits. And so one of the key things we can do is how do you embed those hard lessons learned into the system and do that? Because there's a basic presumption that that in some ways there's a barbell-shaped market, one part of the market or of the industry that's tied to this fight of today, very rapid acquisition, leveraging commercial technologies. I'm fighting against guys with box cutters, and spending $10 million developing a device is not a smart thing. The troops know how to do that. There's the other end where it's near-peer adversary, and I do need these traditional players to do that. How can I get them to move a little bit faster and cross-pollinate? Again, don't extend the lessons too far in either direction. But the number one thing I think we can do is make sure that that the mentality that's adopted there gets shifted into the core process where appropriate, particularly related to some of these new technologies where you need the fast turns. Right? Think of how obsolete the technology is inside some of those long 25-year platforms we just talked about.
I'm not sure there's just a whole lot of new ideas on that. Most of them have been identified and articulated. Number one, decide what we want, lock down the requirement, and build to the requirement. Preferably do that with some cooperation between those who need it and those who are going to build it, and reduce the impediments to building it and doing it quickly and without excessive cost. And we know what a lot of those are. Excessive oversight, excessive paperwork, excessive and non-material audits. I had one of our CEOs that told me that he had a program that had ended over 3 years before. The auditor showed up, people.
Mr. Downey, would you suspend for a second? I have difficulty here.
Yeah, sorry.
I don't want to miss what you're saying.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman. But he had a program with the Pentagon that had been completed about 3 years before. There were only a handful of people who were actually on that program, and the auditors showed up. There were actually more auditors than had ever worked on the program, and he had to go out and hire some accounting people on the back end. Now that's cost, and that's going back in the system. So Ben Rich, who was the head of the fabled Skunk Works, pointed out in his book that over his tenure, the oversight and paperwork had increased to the point that, in his words, we put more and more into the big end of the funnel to get less and less out the small end, and it just got worse and worse. And he wrote that in 1994. So you can imagine what it's like at this point.
Back in 2006, General Kadish, when he retired, did an acquisition assessment, and one of the recommendations in that report was something called time-certain acquisition, where you set a 4 or 5 year hard, you either deliver the product by then or the program is canceled kind of an approach. I understand that when they did the outside look at the last QDR, General Larry Welch was involved in that. He has a lot of acquisition experience and essentially made the same recommendation. You'll find it in Gansler's book. You'll find it in our report. The caveat that goes with that, of course, is you have to ruthlessly adhere to the time-certain delivery schedules and not sit there towards the end of the program as it's starting to slip in terms of schedule and cost is going up and decide, well, we spent all that money so we can't afford to actually cut it off. That's a very difficult thing, as I'm sure all of you know in terms of listening to industry constituents from your states. Lastly, I'll just mention, to touch on what Fred talked about the oversight. I recently talked to some people from one of the major contractors where they had a product that was it had originally been built for one of the services, and now they were starting to sell commercial versions of it. And the difference in oversight at government contractor oversight of the program, actually in the factory, was the difference between 5 or 6 on the commercial side and 100 plus on the government side. And as Fred just correctly said, that's cost. There's just no doubt about it. It also makes schedule slip.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Anabusa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chow, and by the way, gentlemen, I still want your writing to my last line of questions. I wanted in writing your responses. But Mr. Chow, let's move on. I like your concept of policy by acquisition. I think that's a great way of putting it, and that's probably what we're doing. I also went over your slideshow, and what caught my eye was, of course, the second page that says a few ways to think of industrial policy affairs. One of the things in here that causes me somewhat concern, and I'd like to go over it with you. You talk about the life cycle of technology industry sectors, and it's this curve that ends up with stability decline, which seems, and you have all these other things on the bottom, and it basically points to fewer competition. And that's really the purpose of, I think, this committee. We were looking at, as we begin to look at the cuts in the defense budget, we were actually more concentrating on small and medium-sized businesses because the big guys will, as your chart in here shows, they practically have everything else. But this is troubling to me because what you seem to be saying is that we're just headed for fewer competitors and we're headed for some kind of decline. Am I reading your chart correctly?
You are from a technological standpoint to the extent that every industry runs through its normal cycle. And the commercial industry runs through it much faster, and the cycle gets restarted, right? There's a part of the curve that reboots the cycle. And so, and I think, again, that's part of the, if you want to be harsh about it, the technologies we're most stressed about, aircraft, space launch, shipbuilding, those are technologies of the 1910s, 1920s, right? Now, the difference between the commercial world and defense is actually we still use those technologies, right? So that decline phase goes on for a very long period, which is why, or I would call it stability in terms of maturity of technology. And so all it says is that the policies and things you want to focus in on are different. That is going to be a negotiated relationship with that because of the age of those technologies, there will naturally be fewer competitors, period, full stop.
And we put the policy by acquisition and overlay that.
Right.
We also seem to be saying that because we're continuing maintaining those old technologies of 1910, which, as you're saying, we may put a new coat of paint or we may beef it up a little bit, but we're seemingly then doing what you're kind of guarding or telling us to guard against, which is we're maintaining the old technologies because by doing that, we're setting the policy through our acquisitions.
In some cases, you should, because they're still very valid technologies. So to date, no one has yet sort of come up with a substitute for the submarine, right? And
right.
So it's a core capability set. No one has come up with a substitute for, again, the heavy space launch. You have some guys who are trying to do that, and that's why I think as you look at this, and to Mr. Downey's point, Mr. Watts' point, that it is where you should be spending your time, because it's going to be the thorniest problems of how do I keep these capabilities alive, while at the same time you should be spending R&D money. We should be encouraging the young innovators to see who's going to come up with an answer for that, because I guarantee you something, if we don't, the adversaries will. They don't have $700 billion to spend on sustaining that base. They're trying to solve the exact same problem at 1/10 the cost, and guess what? That forces them to be really innovative, which is why they come up with box cutters, or they come up with drones or others.
Well, I still have you. The barbell, which is what you were mentioning, I think in relationship to Congressman West, you have it also in your handout. I'm trying to understand slice 1 and slice 2, and if you can do that very quickly for me.
Yeah, it's just two different ways of looking at it. So one way is to think about it from the dynamics of the left-hand side of the barbell, which is tied to the fight of today. It's very much, again, pulling technologies off the shelf. Think of the MRAP, think of those technologies. In fact, back to the ITAR issue, 4 of the 5 designs were overseas designs, right, that was able to pull. The more traditional side of it is our old stately system of acquisition that we know and love and sort of moves along. That's one way of thinking about it. The other way of thinking about it also is from the types of companies. The smaller, younger, more innovative ones are the ones that we've found in that have been taking advantage of this rapid acquisition system. I'm not going to give the creation of the building of FCS or the gig or large networks or F-22 to a small startup. It's just not the right scale and appropriateness. So you need both ends. The biggest dilemma for the companies themselves is, can they operate on both ends of the barbell or not? Right, and so that's what they're struggling with. And they're beginning to question that once the war is over, will the left-hand side of the barbell live anymore? I would submit to you, SOCOM lives in that world all the time. The intelligence community lives in that world all the time. So there is an enduring market.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Well, thank you. You mentioned about the MRAP, and I got to know a Special Forces colonel. Well, not a colonel now, he's a general, but he was in Somalia, and he talked about they had in Somalia deployed some up-armored vehicles. I don't know which country, South Africa or somewhere, and he came back after Somalia and said, we need these for urban, if we're ever going to an urban environment again. Well, we just poo-pooed that, and then we had the situation in Iraq, and we should have learned from that. But going back to the point, we don't predict very well what we're going to be doing, and I guess we don't listen to people that have been actually in those situations and know what they're talking about. You had mentioned earlier that Secretary Panetta and Secretary Gates had started to engage at least the large defense contractors. Is DoD doing anything, in your view, sufficient enough to reach down into the mid-level and smaller companies to engage with them in some kind of dialogue so that we can you talk about that a little bit?
And then you can. It's harder. There are things like the mentor protege programs that I find useful. There are other. It's back to there are other entities who sort of are tasked to do that, like DARPA that has been reaching. But in dealing with those companies, that's been one of their biggest frustrations. Has been they don't even begin to know where to start, how to interface, how to begin to get in. They would love to have an ombudsman or somebody that could be their champion. They look to the small business sort of advocates to do that. As you know, some groups are better than others in terms of following that. It's a perpetual sort of grinding of the gears.
That would be something you'd recommend for us to look at, strongly at, having somebody in there that's looking out for the smaller guys that are more aggressive. I guess there's an office at DoD that's supposed to be doing that, and we're going to have them in front of us. But I get the sense that they don't have too many resources behind them to be able to do that.
There is, and again, the thing to be careful about is setting small business set-asides, which I understand is part of a policy, also has sometimes some of its unintended consequences, right? There are companies that have loved sticking within that and don't want to graduate because once you graduate, you're in the maelstrom, and that's not quite what we want them to do, right? We want them to use that to get to a certain level and then graduate into that mid-tier without having to sell out. And so we always have to be very vigilant about these kind of one-size-fits-all things.
Downey?
I think they are, and I think your witness in the coming hearing will be able to talk to a lot of that. One of the problems is the Pentagon actually coming up with an inventory of who the aerospace and defense industrial base suppliers actually are. We don't really have an inventory. The OEMs, the large producers, have a pretty good handle on what their supply chain is, but there's not much of a horizontal. Brett Lambert, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary, does have a program that they have been implementing. But there are a lot of them. I think 25,000 suppliers is kind of a guesstimate. And 97,500. That's
include everybody.
And so that's pretty hard. And frankly, I think my own personal opinion is you should look at it. Doing business with the Pentagon is difficult, intimidating, and for small companies, darn near impossible. To have the lawyers, accountants, and advocates that's necessary to understand the federal acquisition regulations and operate successously without penalty in that world scares away a lot of people and is scaring some of the people who are actually doing it now out of the business. And I think if we don't get a handle on that, we're going to lose capability that we wish we had.
Right. Watts, any comments?
Well, I just touch on ITAR's kinds of constraints on being able to access the global defense industry really is a significant constraint these days. I mean, the specialty metals thing came back in Iraq when people had started running into IEDs. You had Humvees that were not armored. You could get access to additional armor to add to the Humvees in country, but that ran into the Berry Amendment kinds of restrictions, which sort of said to people, really, if you're going to follow the rules and regulations, you're going to have to go all the way back to the United States to get armor plate that's available locally. I mean, these kinds of constraints, I think in that particular case, probably led to some people dying. And, those kinds of constraints, it just seems to me we do need to do something about.
Right. And one final question. What role, what's an appropriate role for the industry to work with DOD to assessing the health of the structure and, as we move forward, what's the role of the industry?
Well, DOD is going to supply an awful lot of the data that the Pentagon doesn't have, for a starter.
Right.
And, the more you can get the companies to work as a team with the Defense Department or Homeland Security, I think the better off you're going to be.
And do we have now laws in place, in your view, that stop us from doing that? Keeping these, arm's length instead of bringing them in and be part of the team?
Well, I go back to a program that in my industry days I was really familiar with, the B-2 bomber, which is not everybody's favorite acquisition for a variety of reasons, including the unit cost at the end of the program. But that program was eventually won by Northrop. The competitor was Lockheed, who'd built the F-117, and the Air Force basically wanted a high flyer. There was going to be a high altitude penetrator, period, end of story. 2 years or so into the program, the Air Force changed their mind and wanted low altitude penetration. And as I discussed with some of the staffers for the panel, a couple of weeks back, that required a major wing redesign, except the airplane was a flying wing. So if you imposed a lot of cost and a lot of delay by having essentially requirements creep in that particular program. We haven't talked too much about the requirements process, but that's another piece of this whole system which, in my view, could use a lot more coherence and discipline.
Mr. Downey.
Mr. Chairman, there are, in fact, impediments to adequate cooperation. Some of those are cultural, some of them are institutional, some of them fall into the category of laws and regulations, and some of them are absolutely correct. At some level, you do have competition, and you do have a need to protect proprietary information on both sides. But increasingly, industry views the relationship, and I'm not talking about just in the last few months or even the last couple of years, as increasingly adversarial. Witness the most recent letter out of the administration that would tighten or reduce the ability of military officers to participate in widely attended events. So you end up with the problem of what's intended, what's written, what's interpreted, and when you get down into the organization, it's just an awful lot easier to avoid the whole thing than defend yourself or try to explain it later.
I think it's a terrible problem. You don't want people to talk to people when it's completely appropriate and necessary. Mr. Chow?
It's a huge issue, and it's politically difficult and hard to raise. And it's another one where it's creating a really unintended consequence. If I can't talk to people and I can't sort of get basic information, so what happens? You're then forced to recruit retiring military people because that's the only way you get to understand what's going on inside, which then raises the specter of the issue of what's going on. And so I tighten laws about that, and I get even more and more removed every step of the way until the point where I can't talk to my basic customer in order to understand what's going on. And that then has other second-order consequences. But to sit there and say, I want to speed up the revolving door is political suicide, and so it's a topic that we don't really touch at. But again, I think you're touching on one of these core fundamental issues. If you can figure out a way to gently look at the issue, I would really encourage you to do so.
That's what we hope to. But that brings right back to Mr. Watts started out saying this is not a free market system. Because in a free market system, you go to the customer and what do you want? Explain it to me, and I'll try to come up with something that satisfies your needs. So it brings us right around, and that's one of the things we need to explore because we know it's a big problem. Again, I want to thank all of you for giving of your time today and your expertise. I'm sure as we move forward, and it's Ms. Hannah Busa, I think she has some questions, and we may have questions further that hopefully we can talk to you and get your input, because I had just in this room a couple of weeks ago, we had a meeting with former Secretary Rumsfeld, and I said we had this panel, and what do you see at the Department of Defense? And he looked at me and smiled, and he said, if I was advising a small business, I'd tell him, don't do business with DOD. He said it's too difficult. And his quote, his comparison was, it's like sleeping with a hippopotamus. Eventually, it's going to roll over and crush you, and you'll never know they did it to you. So it was a very concerning comment. But I'm not willing to take that point because I think it's critical. And he did say also that a lot of the great ideas, if not all the great ideas, and the new technologies are coming from small and medium-sized companies that are nimble. But he said it's just so difficult. So that's what hopefully we're tasked here. We'll come up with some solutions to change that, to change the culture, to change the laws, and make sure that those small and medium-sized companies continue to be a very important and very important part of the new technologies that emerge to protect our warfighters and our nation. So again, thank you all very much for being here. And we have a field hearing Friday in Akron, Ohio. Looking forward to it. I got a list here. You got a number of companies. So looking forward to that as we go to Ohio on Friday, and hope all members or most of our members can join us. So again, thank you very much, and this hearing is adjourned.